And now our host, Stephen Lee Morris.
Mike Meyers is the managing director of Ruskin Theater Group in Santa Monica, which is a theater and teaching center located on the grounds of the Santa Monica Airport, which is city-owned. Mike also served for 12 years on the Santa Monica Arts Commission. He was for some time, he was the president of that commission, and he was termed out and has now been an advocate for the Santa Monica Arts Groups through the pandemic and the various crises that it's brought. Things look like they're not far from perfect, but they're a lot better than they were in Santa Monica. They've been through an arduous process, and Mike is here to tell us how things have worked on a humanitarian level and on an administrative level in Santa Monica, and how they've gotten through the pandemic. Mike Meyers, welcome to Animal Farm.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. Pleasure.
It's good to have you. You have some stories to tell that are unusual in that you are not a tenant with a traditional landlord. Your landlord is the city, in this case, the city of Santa Monica.
Correct.
The Ruskin Group Theater is located on the airport property of the Santa Monica Airport, which is owned by and administered by the city. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the pandemic, let's go back to the 90s when you were advocating for arts policy in Santa Monica, and what were the policies that you got in place that are on the books in Santa Monica, and how what actually unfolded during the pandemic was somewhat of, was that the kindest way to say it was in contradiction of those principles, but it's kind of been ironed out. But let's go back to the history, because the history is the larger context.
So in 1999, the city of Santa Monica commissioned a report. And in that report, it was called Economic Challenges. And they deciphered that the greatest threat to the arts community in the city of Santa Monica was the escalating prices of real estate. And that if the city didn't provide some kind of safe havens on their own property, there would be no arts uses in Santa Monica.
No.
Right? So from that report, we started working on trying to have the city adopt a cultural Bible, like a plan that codifies the city's priorities for the arts, and that turned into Creative Capital, which was a major effort to get the city council to pass, and basically it prioritized arts uses at a number of city-owned properties.
Creative Capital is the name of a guiding principle?
Yeah, it's the name of the cultural plan. It's the name of the cultural plan that was enacted in 2006 and is still in place to this day.
And you worked with the Santa Monica Arts Commission, one would presume, en route to the city council.
I worked with the Santa Monica Arts Commission, and then in 2009, I was appointed to the Santa Monica Arts Commission at the tender age of 30. And 2 years later, I was the vice chair. And then for the next 10 years, I was the chair. So I chaired the Santa Monica Arts Commission for a decade. I was termed out after 12 years of service right before the pandemic.
Is that termed or turned, or does it make any difference?
Well, it's a term. They have term limits. There's commissions in Santa Monica of 12 years, and so 12 years. You got to see how the sausage was made.
Yes,
and it's very illuminating, right? So after having gotten Creative Capital implemented with a lobbying arm of the city and using every connection of the Ruskin, I was then asked to apply for the Arts Commission, and then sort of started implementing Creative Capital as an arts commissioner. And the way we did that is we sort of prioritized that, as complicated as it was, is that the Santa Monica Airport, which is 270 acres, and has the largest concentration of artists anywhere in the city, working artists, right? Because there's art studios. In 1999, the city made below market rents for the old hangars. So fine artists got to get in at like 67 cents a square foot, right?
Yeah.
So where my involvement comes is that when we wanted to open our theater, we had been at the airport forever, and I knew that there was cheap rent for artists. So when the Ruskin gets this space, we're thinking, okay, we're going to be able to afford it. And they offer a quote of market rent. I said, I thought it was cheaper for artists. And they said, it's only fine artists. So that's sort of where my involvement and sort of advocacy began is that I said, well, why are we pitting artists against each other?
Yeah.
You know,
So theater is not so fine, is what they were saying.
they thought theater was not so fine. And so our first 8 years of occupancy, we were paying market rent until finally through Creative Capital, it rolled back around to say, hey, we have to be good to all arts groups. And they prioritized the airport, the Civic Center, and Bergamot Station as places where art uses can exist in the city affordably.
And City Garages, of course, is the one theater located inside Bergamot Station. Now, when you say they did this, this is lobbying on behalf of the Arts Commission to the City Council.
Correct. Right.
And it gets through. Okay. Okay. So now you've got this thing and says you've got this Creative Capital policy in place, which, as you say, is their arts Bible that says they have to make an effort to prioritize the arts, which is understood is not a profit-making entity, unlike a shoe store. And so they have to cut them some slack for the community interest of having of having a culture that's not just commercial. It's just
and some cool things happen with that. Like, so for example, we knew that a cultural plan wasn't enough, that we needed to get some of these values ingrained in what's called the land use circulation element, which is the guiding principles of a city for development that lasts for 30 years, right?
Yes. Yes.
Also able to get some of the principles of Creative Capital into this land use circulation element, which really helped us. So we're all chugging along, and then we start dealing with, you know, as I was, I think, joking with you, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So as we learned the hard way throughout this pandemic is once everything shut down, the city couldn't perform on their 30-year promises, because something that I didn't know until the pandemic is that cities are not allowed to run deficits at all. It's literally dollar in, dollar out. Yeah. There's no mechanism for them to do it. So when the pandemic started and all of the artists got together to say, hey, what are we going to do with these rents? We can't afford it. The city literally said, unless we get aid from the federal government, because the city was left out of the first CARES Act because it was too small, right? Even though the city of Santa Monica has an $800 million budget, their population of 90,000 eliminated them from any funding because the first round of CARES Act only applied to cities with 100,000 or more. Mm-hmm. So the city's going, we're screwed. We don't know how we can help you. So after the election and after the results in Georgia, it became clear that the city was going to get money. So once we knew that the city was going to get $30 million, we really advocated as an arts group to say, in order for you to hold true to these arts promises you've made for 30 years, 20 years, 15 years, you have to set aside 20% of the American.
Wait, can we back up a little detail you had mentioned earlier, and I just want to get it out there. Before this lobbying effort took place that you're now describing, their remedy was there would be no rent abatement whatsoever, and that they, however, would give arts organizations 12 months to pay off all their rent that was in arrears, which is no help at all.
No, it was no help at all. And, you know, when they basically had a budget prioritization meeting, the city council, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody told us, you know, they're going to really deal with this in June, so don't worry about it now. And, you know, now that I'm not on the commission, I can say it based off of my knowledge of inside baseball. I organized the whole arts community to say, no one's going to this meeting. We need to hijack it. Yeah. And so we hijacked the meeting in March with over 100 supporters who just basically said, you have to help all these arts groups, from, you know, City Garage at Bergamot Station to the galleries at Bergamot Station to a great nonprofit at Bergamot called Building Bridges.
Full disclosure that this show is produced by City Garage Theater, just to be clear.
They deserve a lot of credit for their help in the advocacy that helped. Because, you know, the cool thing about what happened was it wasn't just theaters that got rent abatement. It was artists at the airport that had studios. Mm-hmm. It was theaters. It was other nonprofits that helped kids that through arts remedies. So I think that what ended up happening was the right thing. And sometimes because, you know, cities start off in this sort of rigid place of they laid off 560 full-time employees. They didn't know what kind of money they had. They were trying to reintroduce programs, and it's really hard sometimes when you're advocating for the arts on a municipal level, because you're constantly having to remember that you're up against all these other needs in the community.
So let's back up for a moment. We have the Biden administration is in. Suddenly, Santa Monica qualifies for the CARES Act. They have, you said, $30 million rolling into their coffers, and yet they are still resistant to help these theaters. Is that correct?
I don't. So it felt that way at first, but in hindsight, I think what they were doing is they were trying to figure out all these other levels of services to the community that they had cut in the pandemic, and which ones they should put back into place. And I think as much as they value or say they value the arts, it wasn't a priority when it comes to their need to deal with the homeless problem, their need to keep visitors in their apartments, their need to reinvigorate the after-school programs.
Yes.
So without a major advocacy push, I don't think it would have happened, because I think staff was operating from what their understanding of the city council's priorities were.
Yeah, it's putting out fires. Which fire is the biggest?
Which fire is the biggest? Yeah. So I do really, as much as it was a fight, there, I don't think anybody was nefarious, because I think people were literally doing the very best they could. Like, I have friends who work in the city, and when 500 people got laid off, and they were working around the clock, and it got to be pretty thankless for a lot of them as they're trying to keep the city running through not only a pandemic that we had in Santa Monica, but May 31st of 2020, there was a lot of looting that happened in the city. Businesses burned down. So on top of the pandemic, the city then had this other sort of high action event, which led to the resignation of the police chief, right? And they lost their city manager. Obviously, sometimes I think as artists, we always have that empathy. And so when I look back on it now, it's like, cities, like all of us, aren't necessarily groomed to know how to deal with a pandemic of the size that we just went through.
So what was the resolution after your lobbying efforts and after the city council finally voted? They've got $50 million. What was the shift, and what's the resolution? Because the resolution has now happened.
The shift was, the resolution is that nonprofit arts tenants and all nonprofits in the city, actually, that had leases with the city got 9 months of rental abatement, and they got a year and a half to pay back the back rent. And
the back rent is now 6 months.
Yeah. And if they can't pay back that back rent in a year and a half, we get to go back to council and ask for an extension.
Good.
So I think that they're very invested in trying to see a lot of their arts tenants make it through this pandemic.
Okay.
And so that was a really good resolution. So nonprofits got 9 months, the galleries got 6 months, and then every other type of city tenant, whether it was a artist studio or a restaurant, got between 3 to 6 months.
Well, that's a huge improvement over what you were facing at the onset of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so let's move to Ruskin Group Theater and where you're at right now in mid-July 2021.
July 2021. It's so funny because when we had to transition online, both for the Ruskin Group Theater and the Ruskin School of Acting, that scaling felt less daunting than the scaling back to in-person for both of them. And partly it's because, somehow this public health crisis has been so politicized that, from our opinion, I started going out again about a month and a half ago to friends who own clubs. Like my friends own Harvell's, friends that play at the Hot Club. They play at the Cinema Bar. And I noticed that they had these signs that just say basically, if you enter into this place unmasked, you attest that you are vaccinated. And I thought about some of the elderly clientele that has been dying to get back to the Ruskin. And I was like, they're never going to feel comfortable with that.
Yeah.
So we instituted mandatory vaccination requirement or a negative PCR test 48 hours before any event at the Ruskin. Whether it's a class, whether it's anything else, if you're not vaccinated because of a religious or some other reason, you have to submit a negative PCR test that's been taken 48 hours before the event.
Yeah.
And, you know, the pushback from younger people has been very vigilant. I'll say that, you know, that it's, you know, I had one person accuse me of violating their Fourth Amendment right, which I then had to explain to them that only the government could do that. They were all health expert and COVID's a hoax. And, you know,
could you give me a sense of what the percentage of your audience was that held those beliefs?
I'd say I've gotten between the audience and participants.
Yeah.
It's not as bad as some places, but it's about 6%.
6%.
Yeah. I'd say about a few dozen interactions.
Mm-hmm.
Now that is it has been stressful, but the great news is that both the shows next weekend are selling really well. And I think that they're going to be at full capacity. So the people that are buying tickets have no problem attesting that they're going to bring their vaccination card. And
it seems my hunch is that, and this is yet to be determined when you open your doors, but the more vigilant you are, and in a weird way, the more draconian you are, the more confidence you will give to those people who are actually showing up that they're safe.
Well, that's my goal. That's my goal is that I want people to feel like they can relax and get back into the theater, because, you know, having taught virtually for the entire pandemic, when I taught my first in-person class the other day, as much as I was so grateful for so many of the benefits that this medium has given us. I mean, the fact that we can have an interview with both of us in different parts of the state, or the fact that there was still an ability to have connection between humans,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Getting back into that live space where you got to experience it all together,
yeah.
Right? Something happens on stage, and I'll never forget it. You know, two actors get up, and I had to stop it a couple times because they forgot how to use their body.
Yeah.
You're so used to only acting from here that they didn't know what to do with their body, and then the scene started going, and there was contact, and there was a real confrontation, and I started to hear the reactions from the rest of the class, right?
Yeah.
This is what we could never replicate virtually.
That's interesting.
And I was like, oh my God, I missed this. Because I think in some ways we convince ourselves it's as good. No, we're fine. It's not as good, but we're fine. And so in that moment, I knew that I wanted to recreate this feeling for as many of our audience members as possible. And I knew that the only way to do that was to be kind of draconian, was to really be strict.
Yep. Final question, and that is everyone's favorite topic, because I love to point at the clouds on the horizon, and that's the Delta variant. Right now, the scientists are saying, even the CDC, is that if you've been fully vaccinated, there's very little danger posed by it. And so I can see your need for proof of full vaccination. However, because of that 6%, or that's just 6% of your audience in the population, it's probably higher, who are not and who are vulnerable. Every time that Delta variant gets transmitted, and it is wildly infectious, there's a huge risk of it mutating into yet a different variant, which the Pfizer vaccines and the Moderna vaccines will not protect against, and we're right back to zero. Are you monitoring this, or is this a concern for you, or do you think this is just hyperbole?
I mean, I think it's a huge concern. I think that an article I read yesterday was that, you know, Pfizer felt very confident that the vaccine will continue to be effective against different variants that have not yet come yet.
Uh-huh.
I think the greatest way to protect ourselves is by, you know, getting vaccinated, and I think getting vaccinated. I mean, I'm just going to say it, getting vaccinated. So I think that one of the things that, you know, requiring a PCR test does is that it does sort of bar the level of entry if you want to go that way, because they're expensive.
Yeah.
Right. You get one in that kind of time frame. As soon as people mostly see that, they're kind of like, okay, I'm not going to deal with it.
Yeah.
Right? And I'll continue online options for whatever that is. So, I mean, the reality is even though I've given that option, and I can tell you with my students, right? Everybody, it's only the vaccinated people that want to do it because most people don't want to.
Can you explain what a PCR test is and what it entails and why it's expensive?
It's about $100. It's sort of like the test the airlines make you take. Yeah. Right? And because it has to, you need it more rapidly, right? Because it needs to be within 40 minutes. You have to guarantee it. So they can be sort of expensive. And because they are considered more reliable than a lot of other tests, right? They're not just your standard over-the-counter test, which is now coming out too, which is going to be another thing that we all have to deal with is like when people start getting these Costco tests.
Yeah.
Does that work or doesn't work? I mean, I think it's really just trying to be as nimble as possible, as flexible as possible. I mean, I obviously don't want to do anything that's going to put anybody at risk. So it's sort of why the next main stage show is still in the air. I mean, right before the pandemic, we were 3 weeks away from opening the LA premiere of the play version of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, starring Eamon Joseph from the John Singleton Show, Snowfall, and Dan Florek and Lee Garlington. And a lot of them want to do it. They want because the beautiful John Iacovelli set is sitting in the theater, waiting to be used, and it's been paid for. But it is that thing where it's like a couple people are going like, well, let's just wait a couple weeks. We really want to say yes, but let's wait a couple weeks.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what we're doing. And that's one of the things that I've also had to say to the city when they judge our activity in the next few months in terms of paying rent or our ability to make money is that it's really hard to really say right now, okay, I'm going to commit to a 6 week thing because we really don't know what we don't know. Right.
Yep. Interesting. Yep. Quoting the late Donald Rumsfeld, that was his line, I think.
Well, that's not company I usually like to be associated with.
But it's a good quote nonetheless. It's a good quote. Mike Meyers, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Next week, Animal Farm honors longtime theater critic Neil Weaver, who died July 8th. After serving for decades in Los Angeles as a theater critic and also running his own theater company in New York called the Meat and Potatoes Company. We'll have reflections from people who worked with him, including theater critic and now film critic Amy Nicholson, Sandra Ross, John Imperato, who worked with him in New York, and others.